Okay. Um, why don't we get started? I'm Jordan Smoller, and I am a professor of psychiatry at Mass General Brigham and Harvard Medical School and co-director of the Center for Suicide Research and Prevention at Mass General Brigham and Harvard. And this is one of an ongoing series of webinars that our center has been hosting to explore topics related to suicide and suicide prevention and to educate and share knowledge about these difficult but very important issues. And today is very much in that spirit. We're going to be talking today about the issue of suicide loss, what people who have lost someone to suicide experience, what resources are available to help those experience the grief, who are experiencing the grief that often comes with such a loss, and how each of us can be a support. And this is something that affects many of us. Data suggests that roughly half of all adults in the US will know someone who died by suicide over the course of their lives. Before we begin the conversation, I also just want to acknowledge that this is a sensitive topic and one that might be quite personally difficult for some of those joining us. Our goal is to have an honest and compassionate and useful discussion that acknowledges the complexity of suicide, bereavement, and the many forms that it can take and the kinds of support that can help. But if you feel distressed, please prioritize your own well-being and self-care, and if needed, step away or take a break. So with that, I am very grateful to be joined today by three panelists who bring a combination of their own lived experience of suicide loss and years of professional experience dedicated to supporting loss survivors. And so let me just introduce them to you. First of all, Stephen Kariuskos is an educator, emotion scientist, an expert in grief and loss to suicide. He's also a dedicated advocate for suicide prevention with more than 25 years of experience educating and working with young people. As the founder of Elpis Consulting, Coaching, and Community Building, he partners with schools and organizations and communities to design restorative, inclusive systems that support well-being and connection. And he previously served as Senior Director of Community Education and Outreach at Samaritans Incorporated, and now serves as Director of Postvention and Community Programming at the Kita Center, home to Camp Kita, a free summer camp for young people ages 8 to 17 who have been impacted by a loss to suicide. Michelle Lee is the programs manager for the Massachusetts chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP, where she oversees all prevention, education, and loss and healing initiatives in communities across the Commonwealth. She plans, manages, and implements AFSP's prevention strategies, education, loss and healing, and research connection programs, and has been with AFSP for more than 9 years. And Cece O'Shaughnessy, who is the Senior Director of Suicide Grief Support Services at Samaritans, where she leads innovative postvention programming designed to support suicide loss survivors and strengthen community response to suicide. She oversees safe place grief support groups, survivor to survivor visits, and the implementation of a loss, that is local outreach to suicide survivors team that actually brings immediate peer-based support to individuals and families in the earliest stages of grief. She's also the founder of the Mo Foundation, which was established in the memory of her late husband, and she's been a passionate advocate for expanding suicide prevention and postvention efforts, especially for young people. So I really want to thank you all so much for being here and joining us today for this really important topic. And I think we should probably just get started. I think I will maybe ask each of you about how you got into this work and really what your what you're doing now in your various organizations and activities. So if that's okay, maybe we can start with Michelle.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. As was shared, I'm Michelle Lee. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the programs manager for the Massachusetts chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It was mentioned, Jordan mentioned that I've been in this role for over 9 years, but I've been involved with AFSP for over 20, since losing my dad to suicide when I was 14. Our family, my mom was looking for any type of support and resources, found an Out of the Darkness walk in upstate New York, where I'm originally from. And we walked in our first Out of the Darkness walk as a family and pretty much have been involved ever since. So I was a volunteer. I ran the Boston Marathon for Team AFSP and then was hired. And so this is near and dear to my heart. And I love being able to provide prevention education to schools, companies, churches, community groups, anyone who wants programming, and then also offering support to suicide loss survivors through some of our different initiatives and programs, which we'll share later in the program. So thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here and sharing that. Let me ask Stephen if you would talk a little bit about your journey and what you're doing now.
Yeah. Thank you, Jordan. My name is Stephen Karuskis, and I am the Director of Postvention at the Kita Center. 17 years ago, I had a loss to suicide. My partner, David, died by suicide. At the time, I was a early childhood kindergarten teacher, and the grief kind of kicked me out of my classroom. It made me rethink a lot of things, and so I stepped out of the classroom as a teacher. And one of the first things I did actually was join a peer support group through Samaritans in Boston, which was very helpful. I eventually went back to school, earning a PhD in psychology, focus on suicide prevention work and suicide postvention work, getting into this grief work, which is then took me to that role at Samaritans for a while, which is like full circle years later. And now I one of the people helping run the Kita Center up in Maine, which includes a free summer camp for kids 8 to 17 who've been impacted by suicide loss. And we also have grown from just a camp, not just a camp, but a camp, into doing weekend retreats for young adults. We have a young adult retreat in just 2 weekends away and a family retreat, all for those who have been impacted by suicide loss. So I'm grateful to be here. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you. Fantastic. CC, can I turn to you and ask you the same?
Sure. So my name is Cece O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Senior Director of Suicide Grief Support Services here at Samaritans, which is a nonprofit running over 50 years. We manage programs in intervention, postvention. We answer calls on 988. We have programming for suicide prevention in schools, kind of the whole realm of suicide prevention and postvention. I lost my husband, Mark, to suicide in May of 2020. And like most of us suicide loss survivors, had so many questions, unanswered questions, and looking for connection. And I found that in Samaritans. I actually started as a trainer. Stephen actually hired me a long time ago, and joined the organization to just be with other people who get it. And eventually came into this role to help other people receive the resources that I received that helped me get to the place where I am now. So very passionate about the work and getting help for other loss survivors.
Wow, fantastic. Well, again, it's so powerful to hear your direct experience and also of the tremendous work that you've been doing. I want to talk a little bit about the experience and also uh, what those of us who may be encountering somebody who has had a loss to suicide may want to know or need to know. And I think you've probably all had uh, experience with this, with this issue and this question. In the early days and weeks after a suicide loss, how should we think about best supporting folks who may be beginning this this grief journey? I think people are often um, at a loss or feeling like they don't know how much to do or what to do. It would be really helpful to get your perspectives on that So perhaps, I don't know, Cece, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. The early days are some of the most critical moments after a loss because there is so much stigma around a suicide loss. Some research shows that it takes a suicide loss survivor about 7 years to actually get the help that they need versus somebody that loses someone by natural causes. And so, in the immediate aftermath of a suicide loss, being able to just be present for the person without judgment, criticism, and really creating a space where they feel safe to really ask all of those really hard questions around why did this happen and could I have prevented it, and the blame and the shame and the stigma that comes with the specific type of loss that suicide is. And so I think what we say a lot here is our role is not to fix anyone. You're not broken when you've had a suicide loss, but really our befriending model is about to lean into the pain with that and not turn away because so many people are scared about having that conversation. So in those early days, it's really about just sitting with you and being like, I may not have the exact words to say, but you're not going to do this alone. I'm here with you and we're going to figure it out, and leaning towards them and the pain and the discomfort of it, really.
So that kind of offering to be there and to be a companion and um, to support in the ways that people need, because they often need very different kinds of things at different times and in different circumstances. Uh, Michelle, I don't know if you want to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'll add, I think that was perfect, is the only thing that I would say is to not be afraid also to ask what they do want. Do you want to talk about your loved one? Do you not want to talk about your loved one? Do you want to go for a walk? Would you rather sit here on the couch? I think not being afraid to ask, and maybe they're not going to know, maybe give them one or two options, because in the depths of that grief, it's so hard to make any decisions or to decide what you want. But kind of just giving those, like, I'm going to drop pizza off or I'm going to sit with you on the couch. But just not being afraid to ask what they want, because they might tell you, and hopefully they do. And then I know that this is kind of like jumping ahead, and I apologize if we're going to talk about it later too. But I think too, I think there's a lot of focus, as there should be, on that immediate grief, and just remembering that the grief journey is a process. It is a journey, a lifelong journey. And just to quickly share, based on my experience, we just had the 21-year anniversary of my dad's passing. And I received text messages from family friends, friends who have just been there for me. And I can't tell you how much that means.
Mhm.
It's not a daily check-in. That's probably what it's going to look like in the beginning. But I felt like I get so emotional thinking about it. But just the fact that people continue to check in and remember that day as being the hardest in our lives and still showing that love and compassion. So I just wanted to share that as well, of continuing through the journey.
Mm, yeah, that's beautiful. And I think you also touched on this sense that there isn't an exact time frame for grief, and that I think uh, leads me to ask about what are some of the misconceptions people have. That I think might be one of them, that either about their own grief journey, that they're supposed to have a time limit to it, or other people may be implying that. Um, does anybody want to address the kinds of common misconceptions that maybe we could um, highlight for people to approach perhaps differently? Um, Stephen, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I'm happy to jump in there too. And this still it feeds off of what Michelle and Cece were sharing too, is that what you just shared, Jordan, is that what everyone was sharing. There's not a fix, right? And that it is a journey. And sometimes with kids that I support, sometimes with young people, we talk about it being a story, right? It's a story that we have to tell, and we have to learn how to tell it, and so on. And I think the piece about that ties into that myth is this idea that it's okay to slow the whole thing down, right? And I think that's really important for people. I had a teen a couple months ago say, I'm feeling 42 emotions right now. And I'm like, well, how about if we deal with one of those today, right? Instead of 42, and just really slowing it down because this is part of your story now, and it's always going to be a part of your story. We don't have to fix it or heal it tomorrow. And we're here together, leaning in together on this piece. I think, some other myths that I'm sure Michelle and Cece can add on to is about really why people die by suicide, and really, and very few people, once we have a loss, now I know, right? I know some of the theories of suicide. Before that, when people use the language of being selfish or things like that, and really understanding the complexities and and all the different complicated pieces that go into it, that it's not just one thing, it's layers upon layers of moments that may have taken the person to that piece. So those are just a couple that I can think of right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts about that? Misconceptions, or often I think also people feel like because they're uncertain of how to respond, can sometimes feel like they don't want to say the wrong thing or
Mhm.
intrude, or um, you know, or just feel paralyzed. And I think some of the things that you all have said to or implied to varying degrees is that uh, there isn't necessarily an exact right thing to do, but the sense of being a support or present for somebody as much as they need it uh, can be very helpful. Is that right?
Yeah, I would add to that as well. That loss survivors want to be asked about their person, and I think that there is a myth around if I bring it up, I'm gonna make you sad, or if I tell a story about the person, like that's gonna bring you down. So it's better to just kind of avoid the topic in general, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. We
Mm,
really encourage people to say their names out loud, talk about them, tell stories about them, even like something simple as like, what was their favorite color? What's your favorite memory of them? Because it's not like we know that they're not coming back, right? We know that just by you bringing up their name, you're actually keeping their legacy alive and their presence alive with us. And so that would be one of the bigger myths that we really try to talk about here at Samaritans, of saying, ask me about them, talk to me about them, ask questions.
yeah.
I love that, Cece. We do that. I feel like I've tried to shift that in my practice because that's exactly true. And so when we go to, I'm sure you have the similar experience, our Out of the Darkness walks to fight suicide. The how I was first involved is there's honor beads that we wear that represent our different connections to the cause. And so you don't have to really say anything. You can look around and kind of figure out who is connected to you, even though everyone is all connected. But when I attend those walks now, people say, I lost my brother. They're wearing the orange beads or they're wearing red beads for the loss of a spouse or partner. And I'll say, what was their name? Tell me
Mm.
something about them. And just that shift and them being able to share and feeling like it's a safe space, I feel like changes the trajectory of their grief. And in that moment, they're like, oh, maybe they're not asked that often. So I think it's a really powerful tool to be able to support.
Can I add one more thing there too? Because I think what all of that I love, and then there's that other piece that I hear from people trying to support people who've had a loss, is they feel like they have to do something, right? So in those moments that we're all sharing, tell me their name or tell me a story about them. And then the next step is listen.
Mm,
Right? There's not going to be a fix. There's not going to be anything else you really need to do, but that listening, I know for me, many times, or even 17 years later, when someone asks me about my partner and just listens and says, thank you for sharing, that is exactly what I need.
mm.
Right. So, not trying to even come in with any even condolences, just listening is enough. Right.
That's really powerful, and I think also empowering to people to feel more comfortable in not trying to do uh, the exact right thing, but something that we
Mhm.
all can do.
Right.
Um, so, are there particular moments in this journey or circumstances or groups for whom support needs are especially high. That might be in terms of age groups or relationships to somebody who's been lost, or the time course. And I also want to get to um, that there are times, of course, when um, the the toll and the emotional impact and psychological impact can veer into something that requires more attention, including professional attention potentially. But let me start with that question about where are the times, do you think, where and for whom the needs may be particularly acute? Cece, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I want to just start off by saying that all suicide loss is complicated loss by definition. So there's always that trauma component that has to be given love and compassion first before what I like to call like the essence of grief is. So you have to move through all of those questions of the why and the blame and the guilt to get to kind of just like, I just miss them. It doesn't matter how they died. I just really, truly miss them and I'm sad about it. With that being said, I think that support is really important, especially high for those who have witnessed the death. So we see a lot of people that have found their person or that were there with their person when they passed. And that actually adds another layer of trauma that really needs a different type of support, right? It's more of that post-traumatic that trauma response. Also, those that have had a complicated relationship with their person before the loss, which is also very common because unfortunately, most people that die by suicide, I think it's over 90% suffer from a mental health disorder. And so the people that have really complicated relationships with their person, that is another layer of added needed support. We also find that around certain times of the year, so anniversaries, birthdays, anything that has a significant date to the person, people are at a higher risk of depression and anxiety as well. And so really need that extra level of support. So anyone else that's supporting someone, just kind of keep those dates in mind, reminder, and just a small text saying, hey, I know at this time last year, 5 years ago, was really hard. I'm just thinking of you. Can be really, really helpful.
It is remarkable how simple things can mean so much in that context. And related to that, what's the role of sort of group support and some of the services that I know that many of you are involved in that people may not know about? If this occurs to them, or they've experienced a loss, have not been thinking about what other resources might be available in such a circumstances, and the value of peer-to-peer or sharing lived experience. Uh, can you comment on that a little bit? Maybe I'll ask Michelle to comment, and also, especially in the domain of kids and young people, I'll ask Stephen to comment on that as well. Michelle?
Yeah, so in specific for just so I'm understanding, in specific to handling those different time periods that Cece mentioned.
And just in general, the notion that there are groups and survivor loss groups, or other folks who have experienced loss, that can be helpful, and connecting people with those communities can be helpful.
Yeah, so I think we hear this a lot, and I'm sure Stephen and Cece can speak to this as well. The ability to connect, because suicide, as Cece mentioned, is so complex and so different than just a standard natural cause death. So we know a lot of people, and we don't host them. I believe Samaritans does, but survivor support groups for suicide loss survivors to connect and heal and to have that conversation, where they're not feeling judged, where they can really share whatever it is that they want. And I know that a lot of times people, as Cece was saying, I used to attend support groups like that, which I loved. And I know that I always was seeking that more so around the anniversary of when we lost my dad, or around the holidays. And with that, so every year, the Saturday before American Thanksgiving is International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. And it's a day only for suicide loss survivors to connect, heal, share conversation, memories of their loved ones. And it was really intended to be an event that survivors are connecting before the holidays because it is that Saturday before American Thanksgiving. And so just an opportunity, like I said, to connect and heal and grieve and cry if you want. So, there's so many different resources, but I know that the holidays can be challenging. The anniversary dates can be challenging. So supporting folks and allowing them to get involved or engaged in those times is so important. Setting boundaries, we talk about that a lot around those losses. I don't ever work on June 1st. I mentioned that as the anniversary. We just experienced 21 years. I never work. I take the day. Every year looks different, but really just setting those boundaries and making sure that whatever feels right for you is what you're doing, or whatever feels right to the person that you're supporting. And again, not being afraid to ask what is it that you want to do? Do you want to attend a group? Do you want me to see what resources are available for you? Really just kind of engaging and keeping that support there.
Yeah.
Great. And so,
Yeah.
Stephen, let me ask you about
Yeah.
supporting kids and young people who've gone through a terrible loss like this, and the particular things that have been helpful that you've found.
Yeah, this connection piece is so critically important, I think I'll talk about that, and then the other piece here about getting, making sure kids get the support is that this connection piece. Kids come to our camp, week-long camp, right? And they come, and once they realize, because I'll say the first day, everyone here has had a loss of suicide. They're like, I can talk about my brother to anyone. And they're 8 years old, they're 10 years old. And just the weight, you can watch their shoulders drop. You can watch them smile. And really, the other thing too is yes, you can. And then they want to tell a funny story about their brother, right? We always think that they're going to talk about all this other piece, but they really just want to share their person, right? And then they realize they can do that with anyone, and they're running around talking, and they are also getting grief work. So at the camp, they get grief support, but they also, part of this is helping them to learn how to grieve in a healthy way. I think one of the things that we said earlier about populations to reach is young people, kids are developing their skills to thrive in life. And sometimes that's math, and sometimes that's empathy skills. And I don't want anyone to have a loss of suicide. If they have one, though, let's help them develop the healthy skills to grieving so they can thrive around how to build connection, how to be a good listener, how to build healthy coping skills. And we can do that with young kids, and they're ready and they want to talk about it and they know their future is in front of them. So how can they then place this in their life where it's not only it's just a sad moment, but also a moment of growth, healing. So, yeah, those are all really important pieces.
It's great. And oh, sorry, go ahead, Cece.
Jordan, I just, if I may, want to include one of the most beautiful parts of Samaritans is we have almost over 20 peer-to-peer support groups a month. And so we really, really focus on no barriers, totally free, drop in. Anyone is welcome to join. And we also have groups specifically for parents, for partners, for members of the LGBTQ plus group. We have walking groups. We're trying to meet loss survivors anywhere and everywhere that they are, because it's so important for somebody to sit across from you and say, you blamed yourself? Oh, me too. Let's talk about how we can move through that. Let's talk about what that feels like. And that's how we start to process and begin to heal, right? Through that community and connection. The first time I ever joined a group and I saw another woman that had lost their husband too, I had never known anyone that had lost a husband at so young, right? And so, let alone to suicide. And so talking about like, how do you parent? What do you tell your kids? How do you navigate really difficult, like when somebody says what happened, right? How do you navigate your narrative? All of those things and important conversations occur within the community. And it's beautiful to watch when somebody else, again, is like, oh, you too, you felt that way too. How did you work through that? That's the power of peer-to-peer support group. It really is amazing.
That's beautifully said. And the work that you all are doing is just so extraordinary. We've had some questions in the chat, and we'll get to questions in a little bit. But people are very interested in the kinds of services, Camp Kita, the support groups, et cetera. And we are going to share resources a little bit later. And also this broadcast will be on YouTube later. And so we'll have resources in the what do you call that? The comments section or the, I don't know.
Jordan, can I just
Yeah,
mention
go ahead,
something really quick
please.
too? Is I don't know if it existed, Stephen, but I can't even, Cece's talking about the power of connection and the power of healing. I can't imagine if I was able to attend that camp when I was 14 after that loss and kind of working through all of that that was one thing. I went to suicide loss support groups as I was older. But through my teens, my mom was great in getting me into a therapist, but I can't imagine having that connection with other kids who experienced, that same loss, because there was certainly no one. I'm from a really small town. There was no one in my community, at least that they spoke to me about. Maybe they did, who had experienced a suicide loss like that. So I'm just really grateful that these resources exist, that we have come a long way. We still have a ways to go, but I am grateful that there's programming like this for kids now, because I just can't even imagine had I had access to that when I was younger.
And can I just add, because thank you for all of that and everything. It's amazing to watch these kids who come back year after year. They want to come to a camp to grieve, right? They want to come here because that connection is so important. Kids tell me, I can't talk about this at school, but I can talk about it here. So they look forward to 1 week a year where they can just let those shoulders down and share all their emotions. And many of those emotions are about laughter and joy, right? So I agree with you. I mean, I wish I had a summer camp too when I had my loss, right? So I'm grateful to do the work for sure. Yeah.
That healing process through connection uh, is so helpful to so many people. I do want to talk also about when things, may be even more difficult than usual for people, or not than usual, but requiring some kind of further attention or evaluation. We know that people who have been exposed to suicide or lost somebody to suicide do have a higher risk of um, emotional, challenges that include anxiety and even depression, and even a risk factor for suicide themselves. Um, some people have more complicated grief that is in some ways similar to sort of post-traumatic grief that occurs in other circumstances as well, and for which treatments are available. Anybody want to comment on that, on recognizing and helping somebody transition to other options? Is that a part of what you do in the services that you offer? Nobody's taken that. I'll say
Well,
I
that,
can,
yeah,
I'm happy to
yeah,
go.
yeah.
And it's, it's interesting that nobody kind of like jumped up because it's an interesting question, right? I always believe in the idea that it's a holistic approach to grieving, right? So I have one-on-ones with loss survivors, and I can kind of detect that there's something blocking them from moving through the grief, right? Which is really common and interest and understandably normal, right? In that with that specific type of loss, the more help, the better is always what I'm saying. So if somebody has found their person and they have had that trauma, there are certain like EMDR has been really successful with helping people with post-traumatic stress. And what I have found to be people that usually can get from point A to point B has to do with intentionality. So that's something that I always listen for too. Am I being intentional about moving through my grief? Or am I just want to stay in this space? And what we find sometimes is that when people want to stay in the space, it's because they fear that if they move forward with their life, they're leaving their person behind. And so that's another thing that we kind of listen for, right? So if somebody is having a hard time kind of continuing the healing journey, not necessarily saying that you have to be here at a certain time, because that's not how grief works, right? We know it's not linear. You're going to take 10 steps backward, then you're going to take one step forward. But if you're still taking that step forward, that's what we kind of look for. Is there movement? Is there intentionality around the healing process? And then if there's not, what are the blocks that are getting there? But again, therapy, EMDR, peer-to-peer support group, though, comes out usually as one, either the top or the second, when you survey loss survivors about what was it that actually helped them the most, is peer-to-peer support, always. And then if you find that you get stuck in something within that realm, then you call in for extra support and maybe need a clinician, maybe need some, different types of support.
Mhm.
And I'll just share in our space here at the Kita Center that one of the things we look for when we talk to families is that the young people, and again, they're 8 to 17, it's a wide range, but that the young people want to talk about it, that they're open to talking about it, that they've already been talking about it with a therapist. Because I mean, I think it'd be shocking to come here and never have said that out loud that my father died by suicide, right? It wouldn't be helpful to them, right? So we talk to the families. We also want it to be a young person's decision, right? That they say, I want to come to this camp. I want to connect, right? That's just a really important entry point. And also then we also have clinical support here for the kids to, if things rise up, that we are proactive about extra support here. And sometimes the reason why a camper may not come is an 8-year-old maybe has never slept outside, never slept in a cabin outside of their own home, and that's why they're not coming, not because they're not ready in their grief journey. And we are really clear about that too. Again, to what Cece's sharing, that there's no right or wrong to this journey. It's just being ready to openly talk about it because that's what we do here. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, there are some circumstances I mentioned, prolonged grief or complicated grief, which involves, very intensive, preoccupying grief that interferes with people's functioning over a long period of time, and for which, as Cece, I think you were mentioning, it's a sense of not being able to go forward and being really suffering a great deal of impairment. And that is something that can be evaluated, and for which there are particular cognitive, behavioral, and other kinds of therapies that can be helpful as well. So that's another resource that perhaps we can make available in terms of what that entails. We'll be sending a post-event resource list to all the attendees, by the way, and so we'll try to cover more of this there as well. Okay, so let me, we're gonna soon come to the time when we want to share some of those resources and also take some of the questions that have come in from the audience. Let me ask a question about whether and how you think about the role of culture, faith, community attitudes, or positive or challenging, in the grieving process that people are experiencing. Stephen, do you want to touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, I think one of the things, thanks for that question, because I do think it's really important. And sometimes we think culturally, like, okay, so in other parts of the world, but knowing that across our country, across Boston and so on, we just have so many different cultures. It's really important to really reflect and spend time when you're showing up with curiosity and to follow the kind of the survivor's lead, the person who has the loss, about how they talk about it, and not to have judgment. Because there could be a lot of different things rising up for them in different cultures, different communities, stigma, and meaning, right? So, is in their world, is it shameful? Is it sinful? Is it something we don't speak about, right? And then you have to know that's your entry point about how you're going to support that family. Also, in different cultures, we talk a lot about in our Western culture and in the States about this individual journey we're on. But in other cultures, it could potentially more collective or community, and just understanding that that's how that works for some, and they want to be with their family, they want to do this, and we may be suggesting they go do some individual work, which again, it's just understanding culturally. I think then understanding religion and
Mhm.
spirituality and understanding where they are. Um, Faith for some is this lifeline, and for some others in their own story is a source of, maybe exclusion. So just understanding it and listening to how they talk about those things and being curious about um, what they bring in their own story to the story now of their loss to suicide, and helping them where they are, not where I feel they need to be, or bringing in any of my own belief systems. So it's a really important conversation um, that I'm glad we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
With Stephen, I was just gonna kind of add there.
Please.
Um, in terms of, I kind of shared this as kind of the theme of like meeting the survivor where they're at, asking what they want, things like that. I think what Stephen said is exactly the case. I'm sharing a lot of personal experiences, but I think it just helps relate. But my dad was a police officer, and he was also a very religious man. And so I remember the first thing that I asked at 14 was like, what now? When our pastor came over to get ready for services. And then I was so scared of that stigma, specifically around police and law enforcement. And I think again, that conversation has shifted over the last 20 years, thankfully. But I still remember just kind of having those two buckets that I was so worried about the stigma. I was worried about what happens now. He was such a religious person, and what now? So they said something to me that was again really meeting where we were at, and knowing my dad, by saying that, that he will never be judged on the last moments of his life. There was nothing like that. And so that was really helpful for me to take as I was moving forward. So as Stephen said, it's a really important conversation, knowing what the survivor wants and kind of where they're at, and knowing that that might shift and change,
Mhm.
but really just making sure that, we're continuing to have the conversations around whatever that looks like.
Great. Yeah. And also meeting people where they're at and knowing what the people's different needs might be. I want to circle back a little bit to something we touched on, which is sort of the different stages of life for the survivor, whether they're what people may need or be able to process when they're younger, the particular needs and difficulties that older adults may experience rather, in terms of having, let's say, lost a spouse, or having fewer connections perhaps at a certain stage in life. How do you approach that? Obviously, Stephen, you have tremendous experience with what it, the particular challenges and needs for young people in terms of what is what they can process and what's helpful. You want to say anything more about that, those age specific things?
Yeah, I think there is a really important piece about understanding the development of
Mhm.
the brain, right, neurologically, and what they can hear and what they can't, what they are not ready for, right? And it's also important to be truthful, right? I think that's a big piece of these two, because secrecy can really come back in not the best way later on. But I think developmentally, like, depending, and also that's individual, because we can't say this is what every 8-year-old would go through. It's usually a range, right? But I think, we have kids who show up at 8, they'll talk about how much they miss their person, and that's where they're sitting. And 2 years later, they might come back like, I'm really angry at this person, and understand that maybe my father, I'm really angry, and understand developmentally where their brain has grown, what else is it beginning to understand through the rest of their life, the literature and social media and all this other stuff. So now they found out more information, and they're like, I'm angry. And then maybe by the time they're 16, they discover this whole want to find meaning or purpose from the whole thing, or understand the mental health issues of the person. So it's not anger anymore. It's a little bit more of understanding, right? And that journey could look different for every child, but understanding where they are developmentally and supporting them through that, which some of this work is really important, that we're not just doing the grief work, but we're understanding child development, and what they can hear and really receive. Sometimes parents with little kids, they want to share everything, and it's understanding sometimes that's too much for little brain. Just share what they ask. If they ask, like, where are they? Well, I'm not sure. Where do you think they are? Or what happened? Well, they died, right? You don't have to get in all the specifics. Later on, when when their brain can comprehend it, they'll start asking the questions more and more. And I know that's hard for parents, but that's part of just understanding development and in this process. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Cece?
Yeah, I can just share. I think, my girls were 6 and 7 when my husband passed away. And one of the things that I've learned is that exactly what Stephen was saying, their grief has changed so much in the last 6 years. When they were little and I had to have that conversation with them, it was more about like, what happened? Where did he go? What happened? Why isn't he coming back? And just missing him, which is that true raw grief, right? Now they're 13 and 14, and it's all about their identity. How does it affect them and who they are being a child of that's had a parent that passed away, and having those conversations with their friends as teenagers, and not having their dad come to like the eighth grade dance pictures and things like that.
Mm.
So it shifts, and I think one of the things that has been really important for me is meeting them where they are. We talk about that all the time, but with your own children, obviously it's a little bit harder, but saying, what do you need now? Like his anniversary just passed, and we just sat and talked and said, let's start off by saying a memory. What is it that your grief is asking for you at this time of the year? And we use it as a way to remind ourselves that it's going to change, right? It's going to continue changing. And just meeting them where they at and making that okay. The other thing that I think is really important, especially if you're a partner that's lost a partner and you have kids, is managing your own grief while raising kids on your own is extremely difficult. And the one thing that I tell all partners is create spaces where you are allowed to fall apart, and then you can come back to being like, the pilot and the captain of your ship, right? And leading your children and showing them resilience and being a model. But make sure that you're allowed to fall apart too, and that you're allowed to cry in the shower and or scream with some friends, or do whatever it is that you need to do, because your grief is just as important as theirs.
Great. All right.
Thank you for saying that, Cece.
Yeah,
It's
beautiful.
it's helpful. And just one quick thing I didn't include. Sorry, Jordan.
Sure.
One quick thing I didn't include on our resource thing, but Stephen and Cece have talked about it, is there is a resource available. It's called Children's Teens and Suicide Loss. It's long, but it's a really helpful resource. I will try to get that to your team so they can share that as well. But it really is a breakdown of how to have those conversations at age appropriate times. And the shift, like Stephen said, it was created in partnership with the Dougie Center. But I know that that's a helpful resource, and one that I never expected to use since I was a child, but one I'm finding myself looking through now that I have a daughter. And she's so young, she's only 16 months, but I'm like, well, now I have to think about having this conversation because she's going to wonder at some point where her grandpa is. So, it's just really interesting.
So that segues me into just before we get to our audience Q&A, and we do have a bunch of questions that have come in, just to share a couple of resources now. We can put up on the screen a couple that you all have mentioned or suggested. The Kita Center that Stephen talked about with Camp Kita. And again, we will make these available after, but this is a little bit more detail about what programs are available through the Kita Center. And then AFSP, which has a website that's a great source of information about many different aspects of suicide prevention and loss. And I think were those the ones? Yeah. So I know there are a bunch of people who have a lot of questions, and we'll see how many we can get through, and maybe I'll group together a couple that are on a similar theme. One theme that comes up is, how to approach this issue of stigma, guilt. What do you say to folks, for example, who are not necessarily disclosing a suicide that they have experienced loss to, or are expressing this sense of their own guilt or shame, are there any words of wisdom that you might have for folks who want to help those kinds of uh, loss survivors? And guilt, of course, and shame are undoubtedly a very common experience. Cece, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first thing when you're talking to someone about guilt and shame is validating that it's normal, is validating that is really normalizing it, saying, you know what, most loss survivors have this experience of feeling guilt and shame, and blaming themselves and, the canyon of the why did this happen? Really struggled with that. Like, how could he leave my girls? How could he leave me? And so I had a moment with my family where they were like, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. And I was like, you need to let me actually feel this and just hold space so that I can move through it. Because the more that you tell me that it wasn't my fault, the more I'm going to resist that and think that it was. So, like a lot of what we've talked about is really first and foremost creating the safe space to be able to say, I think I could have prevented this. What if I would have called him in that moment? What could I have done differently? And then the other thing and everybody grieves differently. Some people, psychoeducation around suicidality is really, really helpful around that canyon of why question, right? When you start understanding suicide as almost like a sickness versus a choice, it helps people move more through that guilt and that shame. And then the other thing that's really important during that time is just talk about it. That's how we reduce stigma and shame, right? That's how we reduce it. When we talk about it, when we bring the things in our soul, in our deep, dark places out into the light, that's when it starts to kind of move away and we're able to share those conversations. So I would say the first step is giving yourself space to feel the things without fear that they may be true, just with curiosity, love, and compassion, and then really finding other people, peer-to-peer support groups that have gone through it, that you can talk to people about it. And then, Jordan, who has done a lot of work in this space, always says, if you're going to put yourself on trial, make sure that it's a fair one. And so really being fair to yourself around the truth of things. Because one of the things that I've realized in my own life is that it's easier to feel guilt and shame than to feel helpless. And that's one of the biggest things that suicide loss survivors have to really move through, that I was helpless in Mark's passing. That I still get the goosebumps. That's harder to feel than I could have done something, because that gives me an element of control in it. So helping people move through those really difficult moments can be very powerful.
Yes. Beautiful. Any other comments on that? I guess related to that, we have a question about, and we touched on this earlier, but the sort of sense people have that there are certain stages of grief they have to go through on a certain timetable. And can you talk a little bit about the variability in the journey and how you approach supporting people who may be having that sense, voiced or not, about what they should be doing? Or alternatively, when somebody is trying to support you as a loss survivor and is communicating that sense, uh, how you either in your own life or in counseling people have recommended responding to people who have said things that maybe inadvertently were not helpful. Um, how do you manage those things? Anybody want to take that?
I'm happy to, Stephen, unless you have
Yeah, go ahead.
unless you want to jump in. So I think it's been a common theme of grief isn't linear, and it's messy and it's complex, and there's so many different aspects to it. And so it is likely that it is going to continue. Well, it is going to continue your whole life. And it's going to look different. So again, I think it's just a matter of supporting someone where they're at. Like Cece and Stephen have mentioned throughout the grief journey. I think about how I'm in this realm constantly. I'm working with suicide loss survivors who are at so many different points in their journey. And yet there are times where I get upset with myself when I'm still like, this is 21 years ago. Like, how am I still grieving? How am I still feeling so overwhelmed? But it's because I'm growing and learning, and I'm at a different point in my life. And I think about that often of like, especially, I guess I would say, especially with the loss of a parent. Cece, your kids will probably, your girls are going to go through this of your wedding day. I had my first child. There's so many different things that happen in life. And so I give myself grace and take a step back, like Cece said, of it's going to look different at every point in life. And so to just make sure you're getting the support that you need. Like I said, sometimes I really crave that connection around certain times of the year, or connecting with other people who might understand. So this week we're coming up on Father's Day. And so I have to imagine there's a lot of complexities with that, Cece, and myself. So just knowing kind of what's coming. And sometimes it's going to hit you like a brick wall, but just making sure that you have the support and the resources, and that you're that support and resource for somebody that you might be supporting.
That's terrific. Um, we're coming up to the end of the hour. I knew this would go more quickly than we might have expected, but I do want to just take a moment to ask each of you, in wrapping up, what what is one message of hope or encouragement that you want people to leave with, who are experiencing this kind of loss? Let me start perhaps with Stephen.
Yeah, I always try to find like a new one because the
Mhm.
one I'm going to share it's not cliche, but it's one you've heard before. I just think there's so much truth to it, and that's that phrase, "You're not alone."
Mhm.
I just think I don't know why. I mean, maybe I just want to make my own up to own it or something, but I feel like that's one of the best ones out there. When I first went to group 17 years ago, and I lived in Providence. I took the train up to Boston and found the peer support group. And I walked in, and someone took my hand because they saw I was scared, sat me down, and said, "You are not alone."
Mhm.
That's when my grief journey first started. Because I was like, I'm not. Oh, wait. And then everyone in that space who all had different types of losses, right? Like I lost a partner, someone lost a son and so on, but we all were connected in this piece. And I see that sometimes, look, and I say these kids come to camp and I'm not always 100%, I do this work, but like, what do I say? But when I say out loud, everyone here has a loss to suicide. You are not alone. I told you their shoulders drop. They look, they smile, they engage, they hear that. So feeling connected is just so important. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Cece?
Yeah. I think that my message would really be around healing does not mean forgetting. It means moving forward in your life and finding joy again in the small things. And I think that we are all capable and able to move forward and to have their legacy be that we are growing and we are changed and we understand the value of life in a different way and the value of time with people, and really that connection with others is really like the most important thing in life. And so I would just urge everyone to keep going, and especially in the beginning when you feel like there is no way you're ever not going to feel like that. We are all here as living proof that you can. And just take that one step. Just take that one step of whether that's, just going outside for the first day for 5 minutes and then the next day for 10. And then that turns into a walk, or calling a friend, or asking for help when you need it. I've seen thousands of survivors go through the process and get to a different place.
Mm.
And you absolutely can too.
Wow, beautiful. Michelle, do you want to
Thank you. Those are beautiful. I just echo what you said. I wrote on my note, "You are not alone," and then Stephen said it. So, just reiterating what both Stephen and Cece had said of you are not alone, and it is so dark in those depths of the immediate grief and the continued grief. But we are living proof that you can get through it, and there are resources available for you. There is support available for you, and the power of connection will always be important and powerful. So please make sure to take care of yourself. Self-care strategies. I know we hear that all the time, and it feels so ridiculous, especially when you're in that grief, but just managing that and taking care of yourself, and you will get to the other side. And there's going to be dips and turns, but you will get through it.
Fantastic. I really so deeply want to thank all of you for sharing not only your time and your insights and your personal experience, which just really, I think, has been so impactful in this last hour. I know I have learned a lot and also been so moved by your commitment to this issue and to helping others. And so I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody who's watching to thank you deeply for that. I want to thank everybody who has joined us and is listening in, and also remind you that we will make resources available. This notion of connection and not feeling alone, I think, was a theme that came through everywhere there, and we hope that these webinars and this kind of experience can bring that home to many people as well. I think you all accomplished that today in helping, I'm sure, so many people realize that they're not alone and that they can be there for other people. All of us can do that. So thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody. It has been so